If the United States gains control over Venezuelan oil, it's not just one regime that changes. The entire global energy order changes. Today, it's not about Venezuela. It's about a fundamental shift in the balance of power that could reshape the global energy order for years to come. Donald Trump's statement about taking control of the Venezuelan oil sector and managing the country until power is handed over represents a geopolitical turning point, not just a routine escalation of a regional conflict. It's not about Maduro or the chaos in Caracas. It's about control over one of the world's biggest energy levers. If you've watched the previous analyses, this is exactly what we talked about. Venezuela wasn't targeted because of ideology, democracy, or human rights. It was targeted because of oil. Because of what its huge reserves mean for Europe, for Russia, for Saudi Arabia, and for the global energy market. Today's statements from Washington only confirm this picture. Energy is definitely ceasing to appear as a neutral commodity and is fully turning into a tool of geopolitical power. And it's exactly this shift, who gains leverage, who loses it, and what it will do to the world, that we'll be discussing in this video. What happened and why is it not a surprise? After statements came from Washington, and world media were filled with reports about the detention of Nicolas Maduro, much of the public debate focused on the question of whether this is a sudden escalation, an improvised intervention, or an unexpected turn in American policy. However, this view is misleading. If we look at the events in a broader time frame, we don't see a shock, but continuity. The United States did not reach this point overnight. Steps that seem radical today were prepared gradually and systematically. First came sanctions targeting the Venezuelan oil sector, then the isolation of state institutions, cutting off from financial markets and gradually dismantling the country's ability to independently manage its own energy infrastructure. Each of these steps had a clear logic and a clear goal. Today's statements about taking over the management of the Venezuelan oil sector are therefore not a random decision in the chaos of the crisis. They are the logical outcome of a long-term strategy. The moment the state reaches a point where it can no longer effectively control its key source of income, it creates an opening for external intervention. Not military in the classic sense, but economic and administrative. This is exactly what we talked about in the previous analysis about Venezuela. That it's not about Maduro as a person. That it's not even about ideology, democracy, or the country's internal political development. It's about who will have control over one of the largest energy reserves on the planet and who will decide when and in what quantity this oil will reach the world markets. Venezuela was seen from the beginning not as a problem, but as a solution to a broader strategic equation. If we continue to work with this framework, today's news will stop seeming chaotic. They will start to fit together as part of a single long-term plan, the consequences of which go far beyond the borders of Latin America. What the United States of America will gain, and oil as the centerpiece of the operation. If we look at the current situation without emotion and without political slogans, the United States will not gain Venezuela today as a territory or as an ally in the classic sense. They will gain something much more important: influence over the pace, direction, and future use of Venezuelan oil. And this is where the core of the whole operation lies. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. This fact has been known for decades, but for many years, it was practically unusable from a geopolitical standpoint. The amount of raw material is enormous, but it's heavy oil, technologically demanding. And without massive investments, it's practically unsellable on the global market. That's exactly why Venezuela fell into a trap. It had a raw material that it couldn't monetize effectively on its own, and at the same time, it lost access to the technology and capital that would have made it possible. From Washington's view, this is the perfect time. Taking over the management of the oil sector doesn't mean immediately flooding the market with cheap oil. It means gaining control over future potential, over when production will increase, by how much, and where the oil will go. In other words, it's not about today's barrels, but about those that will come in 3, 5, or 10 years. This is a fundamental difference compared to the usual military interventions of the past. It's not about a quick victory or an immediate effect. It's about setting up the energy chessboard for the long term. If the United States can make the decisions, they will gain a tool in Venezuelan production that allows them to balance fluctuations in the Middle East, respond to Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries' decisions, and put pressure on competitors without having to use military force. At the same time, it's a signal to the global market. Venezuela is changing from a dysfunctional and isolated producer into a potential strategic reserve for the West. Not immediately, not without risks, but with enormous significance for the future. The market is reacting cautiously today, but major players are already counting on the fact that a new source could be added to the system, one that is not under the control of Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or Russia. This is exactly where the story's perspective shifts. This is not a humanitarian intervention or an improvised response to the chaos in Caracas. This is a transfer of control over energy potential, which in the future can determine prices, the bargaining power of states, and who will hold leverage during times of global crises. In the next part, it was said that when we look at why Venezuela is an alternative to Saudi Arabia in this equation, and why this poses a problem, not only for Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, but also for the entire current model of oil market management. Why did cheap oil affect Russia more? When Venezuelan oil is discussed as an alternative to Saudi Arabia, it's not about geography or immediate volumes. It's about the system of power. Saudi Arabia is a pillar of the global oil market today because it can quickly increase or decrease production, thereby stabilizing or, on the contrary, moving prices. Venezuela may approach this capability in the future, but the fundamental difference lies in who would hold this lever in their hands. If Venezuelan production were to be restored under Western supervision, a parallel source of oil would emerge outside the traditional control of Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. This means that part of the power currently held by Riyadh would be divided. The market would no longer depend solely on the decisions of a single bloc. There would be a new player who wouldn't play by cartel logic, but according to the geopolitical priorities of the West. This is exactly where we come to the difference between Saudi Arabia and Russia. The drop in oil prices doesn't hurt all producers equally. Saudi Arabia has extremely low extraction costs. It is able to produce oil profitably even at very low prices. At the same time, it has huge financial reserves and a flexible budget system. It can operate for several years with lower revenues without threatening the stability of the regime. Russia does not have this advantage. Its budget is heavily dependent on revenues from oil and gas. Any prolonged drop in prices immediately reduces state revenues, limits the ability to finance military operations, social spending, and the stability of the currency. The Russian economy also has limited access to capital, technology, and Western markets, which means it lacks capital. It doesn't have a backup plan, and there's also a political difference. Saudi Arabia has room for tactical concessions. It can temporarily afford a loss of income in exchange for maintaining its long-term market position. Russia doesn't have this luxury. Every year of low oil prices deepens its dependence on China, weakens its negotiating position, and increases internal tension. That's why Venezuelan oil is so important in this game. If it enters the market as a regulated, strategically timed resource, it can push prices down without dramatic fluctuations. And this is exactly the kind of scenario that is most dangerous for Russia. Not a shock, but long-term pressure that slowly drains the system. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this development is changing. Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries is position and why the cartel may find itself in a situation it's not used to, on the defensive. Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries under pressure and the end of the old model. The previous global oil order was based on a relatively simple principle. A group of producers united in Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. An Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus was able to coordinate production at crucial moments and thus influence the price. This model worked because outside the cartel there was no sufficiently strong, predictable, and politically aligned source that could weaken it in the long term. Venezuela disrupts this assumption, not immediately but systemically. If its production starts to recover under Western supervision, it's not just another producer emerging. A source outside cartel discipline emerges, one that is not bound by Organization of the Petroleum, exporting countries' internal agreements, or by political compromises between Saudi Arabia and Russia. This is a fundamental change for Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries. The cartel only works when it has the supply relatively firmly under control. If a player enters the system who can increase or slow down production according to a completely different logic, Organization of the Petroleum, exporting countries' ability to stabilize prices is weakened. Every decision about cuts or increasing production has to take into account someone whom the cartel cannot force to cooperate. At the same time, the negotiation dynamic changes. Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries was used to playing the role of an indispensable mediator of balance. If the market starts to rely on the existence of an alternative source in the medium term, this position weakens. The cartel is no longer the only firefighter in crises, but just one of the players. For some Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries, this does not pose an existential problem. For others, it does. Countries with higher budget costs, weaker reserves, and political instability are existentially dependent on high oil prices. If the price ceiling shifts lower in the long term, their room for maneuver will dramatically narrow. In this sense, Venezuela does not directly threaten Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries. It threatens it indirectly and permanently. It won't destroy the cartel with a single decision, but it will undermine its ability to manage the market predictably. And that's the biggest problem for a system that relies on coordination and trust. In the next chapter, we'll look at why this is a global game changer and why it's less about war and more about a shift of power in the energy world. Why is it not about war, but about a shift of power? If we look at the whole development from a distance, it's clear that this is not a classic conflict where front lines are being broken or territory is being decided. It's something much quieter and at the same time more lasting. It's about a shift of power in a system that determines who has the ability to influence the pace of global crises and who, on the contrary, is forced to react to them. Energy is key in this system, not because oil itself decides everything, but because it determines the room for maneuver of states. Countries with control over cheap and stable energy sources have more time, more options, and more patience. Countries that depend on high prices or geopolitical tensions play with a limited budget and political capital. Venezuela enters this equation as a potential amplifier of Western power, not by immediately changing the market, but by creating long-term uncertainty for competitors. If you know that in a few years a large politically coordinated source of oil could emerge, you have to adjust your decisions today. Investments, budgets, military planning, and foreign policy. This is a key difference from war. War creates immediate costs and immediate reactions. The shift of energy power creates constant pressure that acts slowly but continuously. It weakens the ability to take risks. It forces the opponent to play defensively, even if they outwardly appear confident. That's why it's important to understand today's events, not as the beginning of chaos, but as the onset of a new phase of conflict management, a phase in which there is less shooting and more setting of conditions. Who will have cheap energy? Who will be able to subsidize their own economy? Who will be able to afford long conflicts and who won't? In this context, the detention of Maduro and the takeover of the oil sector are just the visible tip of a process happening beneath the surface. The real conflict is not taking place in the streets of Caracas, but in future price ranges, investment decisions, and the energy strategies of states. In the final chapter, we will therefore look at what we can expect next. How might Russia, China, and Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries respond? And why is it likely that this is not the end of the story, but its beginning? What will Russia, China, and Organization of the Petroleum exporting countries do? If today's events mean a shift in energy leverage, then the key question is not what the United States did, but how the other players will respond. And this is where it becomes clear that this is not a closed chapter, but the beginning of a new phase of global negotiation. For Russia, the situation is extremely uncomfortable. In the short term, it will try to question the legitimacy of the whole process, talk about violations of sovereignty, and strengthen rhetoric about neo-colonialism. However, this is more of an informational defense than a real strategy. From an economic point of view, Moscow has few options. It doesn't have alternative markets that could absorb the loss of income at lower prices. It also doesn't have sufficient reserves for a long-term price war. Its response will therefore be defensive and focused on slowing down changes, not reversing them. China is in a different position. For Beijing, Venezuela is both a potential source of energy and a geopolitical tool. So far, however, Chinese investments have faced instability, sanctions, and the country's inability to guarantee returns. If Venezuela moves into the Western framework, China will lose some access, but at the same time, it will gain a more stable global market. Its response will be pragmatic. It will try to negotiate, not escalate. For China, predictability is more important than confrontation. Organization of the petroleum exporting countries finds itself in the most complicated situation. The cartel will have to respond in a way that doesn't lose its authority, but at the same time doesn't trigger a price war that not all of its members would survive. The likely scenario is a measure, cautious adaptation, an effort to maintain discipline, reduce volatility, and gradually come to terms with the fact that the market can no longer be managed as it was before. All of this points to one fundamental point. The world is not entering a period of immediate chaos, but rather a period of long-term system adjustment. The old rules are no longer working, and the new ones are only just beginning to take shape. And it is precisely in such moments that it is decided who will have the advantage in the next decade. Venezuela is a catalyst in this story, not the target. The real game is taking place at the level of energy, prices, and bargaining power. Whoever can control the pace of change can also control the pace of conflicts. And that's why today's events shouldn't be seen as the end of one crisis, but as the beginning of a new phase of global balance. A phase in which energy once again determines geopolitics more than armies do.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a donation. To help the video reach more people, please click praise. I appreciate it.